$300 billion per year. That's the amount of money that is laundered in the United States each year. Did you know that? I did not. And the repercussions for America are huge. That's the topic of today's Bold and Blunt. And I am your host, Cheryl Chumley, giving you a Christian conservative look at today's news, politics, culture, and events. $300 billion each year is laundered in the United States of America. According to Zippia, that is a website that, curiously enough, is a job recruitment website, but they have some really good statistics on money laundering, which is a little bit funny when you think of it. But anyhow, money laundering in the United States makes up 15% to 38%. Yeah, that's a big difference, 15 to 38%. But either way you look at it, it's significant. Even 15% lowballing. That's a lot. Makes up 15 to 38% of the money laundered globally. That makes the United States a top money launderer. Fascinating. Bet you didn't know that. Before I get into all that, I want to quickly mention, if you like Bold and Blunt, you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, at Real Life Network, and wherever podcasts are offered. And guess what? Not only can you subscribe to my Bold and Blunt newsletter at the Washington Times. It comes out Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Contains my commentaries that I write at the Washington Times, as well as my twice weekly Bold and Blunt podcast. But you may also subscribe to this new product the Washington Times puts out. My friend Billy Hallowell, my other friend Mark Kellner, both at Washington Times, put together this newsletter, and it's called Higher Ground. It contains all the stuff going on in the world today, in the nation today, in your state, in your local community today, from a faith-based perspective. Commentaries, news reports, podcasts, all contained in this new Higher Ground newsletter. So check it out. Sign up for it. Subscribe to the Washington Times in general. It's a great newspaper. Else I wouldn't work there. So back to the matter of money laundering. 20 money laundering statistics about money laundering in the United States. That's the headline from this Zippia report, from this job recruiting post. Like I said, a little bit funny, but the stats come from March 2023. And I find them interesting because America is the good guy of the world, right? America is the righteous defender of freedom and faith and liberty for the individual. America always fights the good fight. Well, America is also a pretty big money launderer. It starts this way. If Breaking Bad taught us anything, and I know Breaking Bad was this huge show on cable, I don't know, Showtime, HBO, I'm not sure which. I never watched it, but I know it was a huge show. If Breaking Bad taught us anything, it's that money laundering is serious business, despite being highly illegal in the United States. Not just illegal, highly illegal. Money laundering remains a huge issue. In fact, there is tons of money laundering occurring in the United States and across the globe, according to Zippia's extensive research. Zippia's the job posting board. Their extensive research. Approximately $300 billion is laundered through the United States each year. Worldwide, criminals launder between $800 million and $2 trillion each year. In 2020 alone, global banks were hit with $10.4 billion in fines for money laundering violations. $10.4 billion. Banks paid out. Geez, no wonder banks want to fee you to death, right? And guess which bank was the worst? Capital One was the largest American bank fined, ordered to pay out $390 million for failing to report countless transactions. Capital One, who knew? Who knew? I thought it would be Bank of America, to be honest, because I remember when Bank of America years and years and years ago, I think it was under George Bush, when George Bush was pushing the American Dream Down Payment Act and minority home ownership and so forth, and sort of reaching out to the illegal community, to the community in America that had come to America illegally. And it was Bank of America that had announced that it was going to start allowing accounts for illegals or for those who are in the country for only a short period of time. Of course, they don't call them illegals, they call them undocumented workers. And Chase is another bank that welcomes undocumented immigrants as banking customers. You don't need a social security to open accounts with them. You only need, say, a passport or some other means of identification. But anyhow, that's to sidestep. My point is, I'm a little bit surprised that it was Capital One that leads the list of fined banks for failing to report transactions. I would have guessed off the top of my head, Bank of America. Money laundering schemes. Here's another stat from the job recruiting site Zippia, however you want to say it. Money laundering schemes cost between 2% and 5% of the world's total GDP. That seems a little bit significant, yes? And here's a stat that hits home for me. I live in Northern Virginia, right outside D.C. Richmond, Virginia is ranked number 1 for white-collar crimes at 7,504 crimes per 10,000 people. Remember, these are stats reported March 2023. This is extremely high, the website reports, especially when considering the fact that the second highest, Miami, only has 4,237 white-collar crimes per every 10,000 people. Additionally, the worst city for identity theft is Columbus, Ohio, with 368 crimes per 10,000 people. Wow, Richmond, Virginia, right down the road from me. Number 1 white-collar crimes, and not by a little, by a lot. Reading from the list, Richmond, Virginia, tops for white-collar crimes per 10,000 people. Miami, Florida, second. Atlanta, Georgia, third with 3,008. Going down, Columbus, Ohio, Riverside, California, San Francisco, California, Orlando, Charlotte, North Carolina, Denver, Colorado. Let's go down to the bottom of the list here. Houston, Texas, lowest on the list with 608 white-collar crimes per 10,000 people. The country with the highest money laundering risk is not America, it's Afghanistan. Good to know, good to know. But here's why money laundering may be so lucrative. In America, the average prison sentence for money launderers is only 67 months. That's crazy. The minimum jail sentence for money laundering is 1 year. The minimum fine is $1,000. So you play your cards right and you launder millions upon millions of dollars, steal millions upon millions, shelter, hide millions upon millions, and spend a year in jail and pay a fine of $1,000. And this is why there are many globalists, right, and Democrats, and even law enforcement pushing for crypto versus cash. It's a lot easier to track. With the rise of digital currency, the site reports, today's money laundering isn't limited to US dollar or other fiat currencies, fiat dollar bill, right? However, money laundering through cryptocurrency is surprisingly difficult. I don't think it's so surprising that cryptocurrency is easier to track than cash transactions. Cash transactions are a lot harder to track, right? You pay in cash, there's not an electronic footprint for the most part. Yes, you get a receipt from the store, but people can't tell what you bought unless you show them that receipt, or unless security cameras, surveillance cameras go in and see you actually making that purchase, and they match that up to the receipt. The government can't track your movements. If you leave your home in the morning with $1,000 cash in your pocket, and you go and buy coffee, and then you go and buy lunch, and then you go and buy something at the shopping mall, it's a lot harder for the government to track your movements, or police to track your movements, or whomever to track your movements based on just your financial transactions than if you use a credit card or a debit card, or if you make purchases online, easier to track. I mean, a cash society gives individuals privacy, right? Which is why government is moving toward cryptocurrencies and waving your palm like Whole Foods has gone to, right? Waving your palm over some sort of reader and paying for your groceries with the wave of a hand. This is all great for government. This is all great for police. This is all great for hackers. Not so great for privacy advocates. Not so great for maintaining individual liberties. Anyhow, back to the business of money laundering. Why care? Why should you as an individual care? Especially if you're not a business owner, why care? Well, aside from massive disruptions to the economy and the fact that money laundering contributes to a corrupt government, a corrupt society, think of the fentanyl crisis, think of the opioid crisis, think of human trafficking, think of smugglers, drug traffickers, and other criminal operations. We already have in this country a problem with borders, and then when you become a top destination for money laundering, that just adds to the problem. And I have an expert guest today who is going to talk more about this issue. His name is Scott Greytak. He is with Transparency International, a nonprofit dedicated to fighting corruption. Scott, thank you so much for being on Bold and Blunt. It is really great to have you here.
Great to talk to you, Cheryl.
So I'm excited about this topic because usually when you think of the opioid crisis in America, you think open borders, border policy, the cartels, inner city gangs, and so forth. But you don't oftentimes think of what you describe as the enablers, the lawyers and accountants. So talk a little bit about that. But first, tell about your position as U.S. Director of Advocacy for Transparency International. I'm not familiar with that organization.
I appreciate it. Transparency International is the oldest and largest anti-corruption organization in the world. We're in about 120 countries, and we basically try to stop corrupt officials from stealing money from their own people and then hiding it overseas and too often into the United States. And where this intersects with the fentanyl and other drug trafficking crises in the United States is that once upon a time, if you were Pablo Escobar and you wanted to sell drugs into the United States, you could literally take the proceeds of that, the money you got from it, walk into a bank and deposit it in a bank. The U.S. government caught on to this, and so they require every bank to have anti-money laundering safeguards to make sure that they are not being used to launder dirty money. So they have to ask who is behind this bank account, who are the actual people, the beneficial owners of that account. They have to do basically a background check on those people, and then if there's suspicious activity, right? If somebody comes in and deposits, $9,999 increments into the bank, they have to flag that to the Treasury Department so that they can look into it. Those obligations have been on banks for decades, and that has helped stop a lot of drug trafficking operations in the United States, but they don't exist for other folks who help move money into the United States. Like you said, lawyers, accountants, folks who set up anonymous shell companies, these are all Americans, and they are the, as we put it, enablers of not only corrupt money, but the proceeds of drug trafficking into the United States.
Let's talk a minute about the safeguards that you described, and then we'll get into some specifics of what you found lawyers, accountants, and so forth have been able to do under the radar. Some of these safeguards, which people who pay attention to politics and the financial sector specifically in recent years have watched with growing alarm as banks have gotten more and more intrusive to their customers in asking searching questions. And yes, what you describe is an important safeguard against cartels and so forth. But the backlash seems to be growing a bit against banks asking so many questions of their customers. Where do you draw the line?
You know, the Treasury said just last year that of all the places in the world for criminals to hide their dirty money, the United States is now the number one destination for that dirty money in the world. I mean, we are beating out places like the Cayman Islands, the British Virgin Islands, the places you think about when you think about the Pandora Papers or the Panama Papers. So criminals see the fact that they don't have to disclose who is behind their companies. They don't have to go through these background checks. They don't have the same kind of rules that, frankly, a lot of other big financial centers in Europe and elsewhere, they have strict rules, and it's helped keep out a lot of this dirty money, and so it's been coming to the United States. And I think that's why you've seen so much interest in finally bringing transparency to these illicit financial flows. We're really talking about some basic safeguards that have been on the books for every single bank in the United States. We're talking about tens of thousands of banks for decades, for over 50 years. It's basically, if I walk into a bank and I want to open up a checking account, they basically, it's a copy of your driver's license. They're doing a search to make sure I'm not on a sanctions list. They're making a search to make sure I'm not, under indictment in Mexico for trying to traffic drugs. And then if they see that I'm making transactions at their bank and I'm using their bank for things that have no business purpose or suspicious purpose given why I have the account, I'm sending in strangely rounded numbers of transactions to shell companies overseas or something like that, then they have to flag that. These are really basic things. Banks have been doing it for a long time. It's very common sense. A lot of the developed world already has these rules on the books. The United States just needs to play catch up.
Okay, so let's talk about some of the things that lawyers and accountants or other service providers have gotten by with in recent years, or perhaps you know of some notable instances where they've been busted, where they've been caught and apprehended. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I want to paint this picture really clearly. I'm from Ohio, and there were 2 fatal opioid overdoses in Ohio that were tied to a drug trafficking organization that was run by a Chinese synthetic opioid trafficker. This is a major operation that shipped fentanyl analogs and 250 other kinds of drugs to 37 different states across the country. And in order to do that, they formed a shell company that was based in Massachusetts. And it's an anonymous company because they set it up and you have no idea who the actual people are behind it, right? They can call it, America's Best Shell Company if they wanted to, or Americans for America, LLC. You're never going to know who the actual human beings are benefiting from that. And they use these secret anonymous vehicles in order to move their profits and in order to sell these drugs across the United States. There are examples of this, unfortunately, in every corner of the country. There was a lawyer in Dallas who used his firm's account, the account that he takes in his client's money and holds on to his client's money for retainers or whatnot. He used that to launder money in order to be able to sell the proceeds of drugs across the country. You've got examples of accountants, of money managers who are working with drug operations. And the reason that they're able to do that these professionals who are sometimes the best in their business, they know how to give you legal advice. They know how to manage your assets. They know how to, do your books so that everything is kosher. They don't have these kind of anti-money laundering obligations that banks do. And so these criminals know that, right? They're well-financed. They're well-resourced. They know where the loopholes are. They go to them because they know that if they went to a bank, they might hit a brick wall. So they're turning to these lawyers, accountants, etc., because they know they can get the services they need. They know they can move their money without having questions asked about the purposes or who's actually behind the operation.
Is this also, I imagine it would be, but this would also, excuse me, be tied to trafficking as well, yes? Human trafficking? Go ahead.
Exactly. There was a study by one of the leading anti-human trafficking organizations, Polaris, and they basically looked at illicit massage parlors. And they found that these folks do not have a paper trail. When the police would bust an illicit massage parlor, they'd be able to enter the premises and arrest the people there, but they couldn't find out who was actually financing it because they would look up the name of the parlor and there would be no actual human beings listed. It would just have the name LLC or incorporated. They couldn't find who actually controlled it, who benefited from that operation. And so eventually law enforcement is just hitting a brick wall and they're not able to follow the money and root out the people who are benefiting from those illegal activities.
To what degree do you see clamping down tighter on existing border controls, putting a stop to this type of corruption that you're fighting right now?
I think it's really important to connect the dots here. And for a long time, we haven't thought about the fight against corruption as a national security issue. But the National Security Council designated the fight against foreign corruption now as a core national security priority, and I think that's definitely in the right direction. We know about, for example, the Sinaloa cartel in Mexico that relied on folks who were setting up shell companies in the United States, places that formed in places like Wyoming, in order to move money all across the Great Plains, all across the Midwest. There was a U.S. citizen from Arizona who was involved in this. But the only way that they're able to accomplish these purposes is by relying on Americans. And again, it's following the money. It's one thing to be able to have successful drug busts and to be able to have, photo ops of border agents capturing drugs as they're trying to go over the border. But if you don't cut off their ability to finance their operations, then those drugs are just going to keep coming and keep coming and keep coming. And to get at the root of the problem, we've got to not only address the corruption that's taking place in places like Mexico, but the fact that those cartels, that those criminals are able to turn to American accountants, American lawyers, Americans who will set up shell companies for them and rely on people within our own country to help accomplish those purposes. And that's where I think we need to start focusing more of our energy. We got to look at what's happening in our country, the people who are literally profiting from these drugs coming over the border.
With the advent of digital currency, how does that change the shape of the narrative of fighting these shell companies, of going after the enablers?
I mean, fortunately, a lot of the same anti-money laundering rules that apply to hard currency will apply to digital currency. So if you are a Coinbase, if you are a digital wallet and you are moving money on behalf of your customers, you are going to fortunately have to do those same kind of background checks and flagging suspicious transactions that a brick and mortar bank has to do now. But that's a very quickly evolving field. There's a lot of new technology that's out there. Obviously, a lot of that technology is attracting criminals because they see themselves as being one step ahead of law enforcement and the government's ability to respond to it. It is the new frontier for folks. This isn't the days of Pablo Escobar walking into a bank with bags of cash. This is a criminal sitting somewhere trying to, wire this money through an app on their iPhone. And so we've got to make sure that our regulators and our law enforcement have the best tools and technology to be able to stay ahead of it. I think so far the infrastructure has been pretty good, but there are serious gaps that we've also got to address. It should be a much higher priority to follow digital currency, digital wallets, digital assets, because that is going to be the future of the fight against dirty money.
All right, last question, Scott. You're pushing or you're advocating for this piece of legislation called the Enablers Act, which has been supported by this White House administration. Could you detail a little bit of what it is?
So there are dozens of countries around the world that right now, if a client walks into a lawyer's office, if a client walks into an accountant's office, if a client walks into your company formation office and they say, hey, I want to set up a company, I want to register my company in the United States, I want you to move money through an account for me, I want you to advise me on how I should manage my assets. There are countries all around the world, leading economies, that require those people to do background checks, quick background checks on who those clients are. If that client is a company, to find out who the actual human beings are behind those companies. And if they are being asked to do something that they think is illegal or suspicious, to flag that for the federal government through a confidential means of notifying the government so they could look into that. So last year, you saw Republicans and Democrats, you saw law enforcement, you saw the anti-human trafficking community, you saw faith organizations and environmental groups, civil rights groups with police organizations coming together behind what they call the Enablers Act. It was passed by the House of Representatives. The administration supported it at the end of last year. It came very, very close to becoming law through the annual defense bill. Unfortunately, it didn't get over the finish line, but that same coalition of groups is leading the charge again, and we think that this is a matter of time. It's really going to be not an if, but a when.
Does it concern you all, just one follow-up question to that, does it concern you at all the privacies of individuals that potentially could be violated with allowing government so much oversight into individual activities? Does that factor into the equation at all?
Of course, and there are strong protections. I mean, again, banks have been doing this for decades. Tens of thousands of banks and other financial institutions perform these sorts of checks every single day in every single town, every state, all across the country. There are important privacy concerns, but those are built into the system. There are a lot of technical rules about what information a bank can get from their customer, getting consent from that customer for how to use that information, detailing where that information will go and how it is used. This is a policy and a legal architecture that's been around for over 50 years. Nothing is perfect, but when we are up against situations like the trafficking of fentanyl and other opioids into the United States, of foreign corrupt dirty money making its way in, of the financing behind human trafficking, these are the sorts of bigger issues and interests that we think our anti-money laundering laws need to be able to be addressed. Privacy protections are baked into that process. They always have been, they always will be, but we've got to keep our eye on where the threats are now, where the real public safety and danger to Americans' lives are now, and we've got to be able to respond to it with smart policy, especially that's been on the books for so long.
Well, it's a fascinating discussion, and I really appreciate your taking the time to detail it for Bold and Blunt listeners. Scott Greytak, U.S. Director of Advocacy for the organization Transparency International. I really do appreciate your time. Thank you.
Thank you, Cheryl. Good to talk to you.
Interesting discussion, yes. Another interesting Bold and Blunt discussion. If you like Bold and Blunt, remember you may get Bold and Blunt at edify.app, at washingtontimes.com, through Real Life Network, or wherever podcasts are offered. If you are already a subscriber, thank you so much. And if you aren't, please check it out, subscribe. Go to washingtontimes.com, get my newsletter, contains my commentaries and my Bold and Blunt podcasts. And in the meanwhile, don't forget, stay blunt, stay bold.